By having a discussion from Ridley Whittaker, who is a special counsel to RIMSAT, and is going to talk to us about his experiences with his visit to Baikonur, as well as the interactions that he's had with dealing with Russian launch services as well, and some of his ins and outs based on what I've heard before, and I think you'll find it all very interesting. Let's just begin.
I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer. And what I'm going to talk about today is really going to be my reflections on a business development enterprise that was started in the United States with respect to launching satellites in the old Soviet Union, specifically out of Kazakhstan, Baikonur, and leasing those satellite services over the Pacific Rim. Really how that company was organized, the problems that it ran into, and what the status of the effort is today. My name is Ridley Whittaker. I'm an attorney. I practice law here in New York City, and I specialize in telecommunications issues. Since 1993, I've served as counsel to a company known as RIMSAT. RIMSAT was set up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, essentially as a partnership between the government of Tonga, some Malaysian investors, and certain, what I would call residual elements of the Russian Space Agency. RIMSAT entered into an agreement with a company known as Inform Cosmos in Russia, and an agreement with a company known as TongaSat. And the purposes of these agreements were that TongaSat had obtained what they call slots, launching slots, over the South Pacific. And Inform Cosmos had or obtained agreements to provide for the launch of satellites, horizontal satellites, and was to be anticipated later express satellites that were presently on inventory in Russia. A Malaysian investor who had operated a cellular telephone service by license in Malaysia contributed $38 million cash to the effort. The money that was put in basically is foreign money to the tune of $38 million and about $2 million of domestic sourced income. The company is presently in bankruptcy. And what happened to it from the formation when it had $40 million cash and how it ended up in bankruptcy today is somewhat of an interesting story. There have been 2 launches sponsored by RIMSAT, one of which I attended myself personally in Baikonur just about 2 years ago today. Proton rocket launched a horizontal satellite that was set into a geostationary orbit over the South Pacific in the Tongan slot. That satellite and one that had been launched before it were operating satellites, no problem. They were leased to customers throughout the world, primarily a video signal, primarily news agencies, with the exception of some Indian customers who were broadcasting traditional telephone pay subscription services throughout India. There was a lot of tension in this company from the very beginning, because everyone to some extent had different agendas. The Russians, we were dealing with the highest, I believe, the highest level of Russian space agency, specifically Eurocopter, and it was a little bit difficult from the outset, because who in essence were these people from Fort Wayne, Indiana, to be dealing with Russian generals who had been accorded the utmost respect and deference, basically had not had to kowtow to anybody the last 10 years of their professional careers, and all of a sudden they were out selling their satellites to what they thought were, and probably were, rank amateurs in the satellite business. The Russian sale was effected to a company like RIMSAT as opposed to an AT&T, as opposed to a Hughes, simply because RIMSAT was able to operate much more quickly than the large American corporation decision-making process. So back in 1992, when RIMSAT really started in business, there were various large companies competing for the satellites that RIMSAT ultimately leased from the Russians. But RIMSAT simply came up with the money first and proceeded first with respect to obtaining the launches. Down the road, the Russians decided to change the price of the satellites. So after we launched two satellites, the price for the satellites suddenly doubled, well, not suddenly, but gradually doubled. RIMSAT was unable to pay or anticipate paying the doubled price for the satellites. I think the experience that RIMSAT's had with Russian business interests in the quasi-privatized economy is similar to interest that other American companies have had in Russia, and that is a contract is essentially not worth the paper that it's written on. And the question is, what can you do for the Russians as of the moment? Do they need your money, or do they think they have a competing customer that they can offer the same product to for more money? I think RIMSAT suffered from the latter. By the time we had launched two satellites, much to the surprise of the satellite community, to Intelsat, to Hughes, and everyone else, and to some extent to the chagrin of the international satellite community, people sat up and took notice. The Russians had the largest launch vehicle available, the Proton rocket. Baikonur itself was, to me, an anachronism and a contradictory place, and contradictory in many ways. I spent 2 days there. When I arrived at Baikonur, it was in the middle of the night, and we were told that we were going to stay in the hotel where astronauts' families had traditionally been housed, and it was, in fact, the best possible accommodations that one could get in that part of the world. When we got to the hotel, it was a typical, to my mind, I don't know if you ever been in any of these structures, 1950s communist structure. Heavy curtains, hot water didn't work, cold water basically didn't work, there was no air conditioning and very little electricity. And I don't know if it was any better when Yuri Gagarin went up, but I had been told that it hadn't been very good for the last 15 to 20 years, and that what we were seeing was not atypical based on the conditions that the Soviet Union had encountered the last 10 years before its demise and before Perestroika and Gorbachev. The rest of the base, well, let me describe first. It took us about 50 minutes to get to the launch site by a truck, basically a truck, that we drove over unpaved roads. It really had an Abe Lincoln quality to it. I didn't see anything high-tech for 50 minutes. It was certainly nothing like what you'd expect to see or what I grew up seeing on television from Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy, something clean, polished, organized place, shimmering ocean in the background. Baikonur is all desert, and as you probably know, the Russians or the Soviets, when they were launching satellites as well as any recoverable vehicle, did not do, as a general rule, ocean recoveries. Baikonur was designed to achieve recovery of a Russian launch vehicle basically at the same site or close to the same site where it was originally launched. So Baikonur has a launch, if you will, site trajectory of about 200 miles through desert, and it has a railroad in it that basically they bring the vehicles out for launch. As you probably know, and I won't repeat too much of what you probably know, the Russians put together their launch vehicles, including the rockets, horizontally, not vertically, which is a much, I think, based on what I was told, again, you're talking to a layperson in terms of the technology, but it was argued to me, and seemed persuasively argued to me, that was a much safer technology and less stressful upon the launch vehicles in the long run, because it all sat horizontally with no weight on the component parts, and then was just launched vertically. Consequently, they had what seemed to be an extensive rail system for bringing out these launch vehicles in a horizontal mode to the launch sites. The housing looked awful. Everything looked awful. Even the buildings where they constructed the rockets or the satellites, of course, weren't built there. They're built up in Krasnoyarsk, up in Siberia. But everything, it looked absolutely decrepit and looked like it would look decrepit for years. I mean, there was no way it had reached its decrepit state in the last 10 years. It had always been somewhat decrepit. Despite this, And despite my impressions in this regard, coming over an unpaved road, going to a launch at 8 a.m. Kazakhstan time, we arrived at the launch site, which was the very same place where the Sputnik had been launched. And I stood in the very same place where the Soviet officials stood when Sputnik was launched. And that consisted of a corrugated tin roof on literally a log cabin frame, where you would look out 3 miles across the Kazakhstan desert, so to speak, and occasionally, coming out of the desert, you would see what looked like a very high-tech mechanism, the tracking devices, etc. Notwithstanding the kind of crude appearance, and the fact that the Russian general who was supervising the launch, because the military was supervising this launch, was using a crank telephone, literally cranked it up. The launch went off perfectly, on time, absolutely no problem. And the unusual effect of a desert launch was that, to me, it was right out of Captain Midnight. For the first 90 seconds, all you saw was the proton rocket going up and the flame, and you heard nothing. And then across the clear desert comes the shockwave. So the shockwave hits you, it is enormously powerful. And then it happened to be a clear day of the launch, and we could watch it go up, basically watch the rocket go up all the way. As you may know, the Russians don't launch into a transit orbit, unlike the Americans. So our satellite was going to get into orbit or not get into orbit based on the launch. We were going straight into our geostationary position. There would be no secondary thrust on the satellite, the horizontal satellite, which at that time was an outmoded, which was basically an outmoded design, far behind Hughes quality, and for that reason we were able to purchase it more cheaply than we would have if we brought a Western satellite over to launch with a proton rocket. The horizon has fewer transponders on it than operable or state-of-the-art American communications satellites. We had anticipated moving into the launch of what was to be called the second generation express satellites, which the Russians had promised us. But following the launch in May of 1994, in early 1995, we got the price increase. There also turned out to be some internal discontent or dispute between various RIMSAT officials, namely its attorney. Additionally, the Russians claimed that the RIMSAT wasn't making timely payments on the express satellites, albeit the price increase. Additionally, Tongasat, which was leasing the slots, claimed that RIMSAT was not making timely payments to Tongasat. The attorney for RIMSAT was sued on legal malpractice grounds, claiming that he allegedly had not properly drafted the contracts with the Russians, which you can see was the beginning of what happens often in venture capital, a dispute among the principals. The company is now in bankruptcy. The Russians, who controlled the operation of the satellites from Siberia, have basically told the customers of RIMSAT that unless RIMSAT pays the Russians through a Budapest bank account, money's not going into Russia, that their transponders will be turned off. So companies such as Reuters are now paying into a Budapest bank account without making any defamatory statements concerning the ultimate recipients of the money through the Budapest bank account. One can only, just a matter of conjecture, where the money is going. The lawyer for the company has been held in contempt by the bankruptcy court in Fort Wayne, Indiana, for failure to disclose his activities with the Russians, and he's subject to a $1,000 a day fine. The Tongans, who originally leased the slots to RIMSAT, have purportedly, and I don't know if this is true or not, supposedly leased the slots back again to the Russians. The fact of the matter is that there really is no Russian entity to deal with or to negotiate with. My view of the Russian economy and the Russian legal structure is that it's so disorganized and so compartmentalized in terms of who's in control of it at various categorical levels, that the seizure of the Russian satellites could arguably be simply a private pension fund for those who have the ability to turn off the signal from Siberia and direct payment into a Budapest bank account. The American government is unwilling, unable, or whatever, to challenge the seizure of the satellites because the American government supports Yeltsin. It doesn't want to challenge Yeltsin in any way. A fair or not fair political decision by the United States government, depending on what your perspective is. But what happened in the context of the development of RIMSAT is, I think, especially interesting because a small group of people from Indiana who knew something about telecommunications were able to persuade an investor in Malaysia to contribute $38 million. Another individual who worked for Intelsat, a Dr. Mats Nilsson, with a great deal of foresight, and some would say enlightened self-interest, was able to persuade the Kingdom of Tonga to make applications to the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva to award slots to Tonga. It basically fell apart, in my view, because the Russians proved to be unreliable partners and put the price of the satellites beyond the reach and scope of what RIMSAT was able to pay. As it stands now, however, there are 2 satellites up and running, fully operable, that were launched by a small company from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the customers continue to use those satellites throughout the Pacific Rim. The Russian launch, privatized launch business has suffered. It's going to probably have over the years, strong competition from the Chinese. And the Russians would have been better off if they had gone along with our contract, probably in the long term of developing business, and used their existing inventory of Proton rockets to continue launches. The future of privatized Russian launches depends in part upon the U.S. Trade Representative of the United States and any modification of a treaty limiting the Russian ability of Russians to launch U.S. manufactured satellites. If, in effect, that embargo is lifted and free competition will exist, so to speak, to the extent that Americans can provide satellites to Russians who have better and cheaper launch capabilities, then you may well see a developing business, again, assuming that there are customers for transponders, which again is a whole other issue as to whether or not the marketplace, the supply is exceeding the demand. As a lawyer, I can tell you lots more about the contracts and how things were negotiated, but I don't really think that is your prime focus here, and I won't go into it. I'd just like to answer questions and see if there's anything I can do to enlighten you based on my experiences. Yes?
It sounds to me like what you're saying is that in terms of Russian satellite design, you would, if you were doing it over again, you would not go with them being the designers and the managers of the satellites, but merely the launch party. Do you think that it would be possible for some European-built satellite to be taken over to the Russians and use their launch services?
I don't think there's a problem with that, except that I'm not aware of an inventory of European satellites that are available. It appears that the inventory of satellites that are available would probably come from the Americans or the Russians. It may well be that the Europeans can get into the satellite manufacturing business in such a way that they can compete. The reason we went with the Russian satellites was they were available. They were available on 2 months' notice. I mean, if you want to launch a U.S. satellite, it's basically like ordering a special model car. You have to wait an extended period for manufacture. We got our satellites up within 16 months, which is just unheard of from the date of contracting, and both for the delivery of the satellite as well as the launch. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
One of the things that I've long been concerned about is basically what we're betting on with respect to the International Space Station with the Russians as a partner. What do you, based upon your personal experience, read into that whole issue of the reliability of the Russians as a partner in the International Space Station based upon what you've seen?
Well, when I was over there in Baikonur, I was there the very day that they were launching a supply rocket up to, it was going off later in the day after our launch. And went right up to the pad where they were launching the supply rocket. Americans were there. Was told by the Americans you'd never get this close, even remotely this close to a rocket about to be launched in the United States. But they were actually fueling it when we were there. And it was the pad where Yuri Gagarin was launched from. Basically, what I took away from that kind of on-site experience is that with respect to Mir, NASA and the Russian Space Agency have a relationship that's really based upon personal relationships between Koptev and the head of NASA. His name is Webb. They have a strong personal relationship. Both the Russian side and the U.S. side, I believe that the NASA funds in Congress are subject to all forms of attachment or riders on bills. Everybody has their own agenda with the Russians that they're trying to keep NASA funding from going to the Mir space station. So, for example, if an Exxon project is being circumvented by Russian authorities, it's typical. I'm not giving you an example. I don't know if this is a precise example. For the Exxon to go to its senators and say, look, I don't want the NASA money to go to Mir until the Russians give me back my oil well. Well, RIMSAT did the same thing. So now our satellites have been seized. We don't want NASA to give funds to the Mir space station until our satellites come back. Well, RIMSAT wasn't very successful in persuading the U.S. Trade Representative or members of Congress that that was a good idea. But because RIMSAT basically has no power. But what RIMSAT did was typically hire a Washington law firm, that a lobbyist, who went up and asserted and espoused RIMSAT's position. But what I learned from what RIMSAT was trying to do to put pressure on the Russians to return the satellites is that the Mir station itself is the number one concern of the Russian Space Agency, because the Russian Space Agency can survive on salaries paid by the United States through government congressionally approved funds. And so you have Yuri Koptev at the Russian Space Agency bending over backwards to make sure that nothing happens to those U.S. congressional funds. And to the extent that he has, and the persons employed by the Russian Space Agency, have a perceived self-interest in promoting the station because it will pay their salaries, and they have no other way to get paid. Because the Duma and the Soviet Parliament, or the Russian Parliament, are not interested particularly in funding Russian space research and continuing funding for Mirs. And it's hard for them to get their money out of Russia. In a peculiar sort of way, the space station will, I think, get a lot of Russian support, or Russian Space Agency support, for the indirect or direct benefit that it pays salaries in Russia. And therefore, you're probably going to see a strong alliance, at least from the Russians, toward NASA, simply because it's a way to survive. I mean, the economy is so bad over there. There was a Russian cosmonaut named Vitaly Sastopolov. I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, but he held at one point, I think, the solo orbiting record. He was a consultant to us. He's a communist. And he's been elected to the Duma as a communist. But his descriptions to me of how difficult it is to pay the salaries of Baikonur and to pay the salaries of the Russian Space Agency leads me to believe that the Russian Space Agency will do anything to keep the Mir's effort going, if only out of survival to keep the persons of the Russian Space Agency employed.
Based upon what you've seen then, though, do you think that their involvement benefits this International Space Station effort or benefits the United States? I mean, politically, a lot of the Russian involvement is being sold on, well, they have all of this experience with long-term space flight and so forth, as far as bringing them into the effort to begin with. Is there any benefit on our side? It's obvious that there's a benefit on the side of the Russians having being a participant? Is there any benefit either to the effort or to us for having them?
Well, based on what I saw, the problem the United States is going to face in cooperating with the Russians in the future is that their R&D is nil. So if we're relying on them for R&D, all they have is product at the moment. And they're stagnant. I mean, that's what we were told at Baikonur. I mean, in Krasnoyarsk, where they're making the satellites, they're not developing new technology nearly at the rate they were under the old Soviet Union. So to the extent that we're relying on them to keep pace with our R&D, that's probably a misplaced reliance. Secondarily, this is all based on what I saw. I mean, there may be things I didn't see which contradict what I'm telling you. But what they have is product, an existing product.
How much of the product in terms of launch boosters do you estimate that they have available?
Well, the latest that they're marketing are their ICBMs for lightweight satellites. I don't know if you know about that. But the problem with the ICBMs is, at least I can give you one graphic example. Apparently, one of the launch silos is about 10 miles outside Moscow, and it has on top of it a deli, literally. And the idea was that if they ever launched their ICBM at the west, that the deli blows up, and then the top of the silo opens up, and up goes the ICBM. And I think, based on what we've been told, that's what their plan was. They have a lot of ICBMs in or near major metropolitan areas to discourage the United States from targeting, effectively, their launch sites. This deli, I know where it is. You could basically call it within Moscow. Now, how do you get the ICBM out of the deli? There's a certain number of rockets that they could use, a number of which I do not know, which are impractical. There are also environmental issues. If you're basically defueling the rocket, apparently there is going to be exposure to the surrounding community with an adverse environmental impact. A client of mine who worked on RIMSAT was offered the opportunity to put together a deal with respect to the ICBMs. The proton rockets, I don't know what the status of that is today. What contracts they've entered into with respect to the launch of their proton rockets. Yeah.
It would seem from your experience that one of the rules of thumb in dealing with the Russians and satellite launches might be to have them launch the satellite, but to keep the actual controls for the satellites on friendlier territory, like maybe within the U.S. itself. Does that seem that way to you? Or?
Yeah, it sure does, but they never even came close to be willing to do that. And I don't think it was a business reason in terms of RIMSAT, it was bureaucratic military. The control facilities were out in Siberia in a city called Krasnoyarsk. I think it probably has about 4 underground nuclear reactors. No American had been there until RIMSAT representatives went there. It's out in Siberia. And I didn't go, but certain principals of my clients went there. That's where they manufacture the satellites, and close to there is where they control the satellites. And the control mechanisms with respect to the satellites, the Russians claim were military secrets. Anybody, well, not anybody. It's possible to jam the satellites. So even if we had control with respect to moving the satellites and using the propulsion systems of the satellites, if the Russians decided they didn't want us to use them, they could still jam them. And when the Russians seized our 2 satellites and effectively not respond to our control directions, one of the options available to RIMSAT, which was not pursued, was to jam the satellites from our downlinking and uplinking base in Subic Bay in the Philippines. So we could have rendered the satellites inoperable, so no one would have made money. It would have been a loss-loss situation. But that decision not to do that was made by the trustee in bankruptcy. So actually obtaining physical control of the propulsion systems of the satellites, if you got into a dispute with the Russians, I don't think would solve any of your problems. Yes.
how do the Tongans manage to get themselves paid? Do they have, through international courts?
Well, that's just reported that they've been paid, but it seems that they are getting paid. Well, the Tongans take the position, since they weren't paid for their slots, which at a certain point in time they weren't by RIMSAD, that they're entitled to be free of that contractual obligation, at least the slots to RIMSAD, and therefore can enter directly into a contract with the Russians. The Russians have raised sovereign immunity to all of the claims by RIMSAD, and a federal judge has got that motion as to whether or not there is sovereign immunity under consideration and hasn't decided it yet. But presumably what the Tongans do is go to the Russians and say, we've got the slots, we've got the satellites, let's do a deal. Yes?
In light of the current thing that happened with the Soviets and this whole satellite business, has this really caused a ripple effect in other contracts in the future? Has it really had any type of impact to your knowledge? And also, will this have any type of impact on the Iridium satellite network, in which they're going to be using protons to do some of the boost to orbit?
Well, to answer your second question first, I don't know the answer to your second question. With respect to the ripple effect, I think not, because I think every Russian opportunity of any magnitude is seen as a golden opportunity, because that's how the Russians present it. I mean, everything is going to work, everything is going to be great, and most of these opportunities have been segregated opportunities. I mean, for instance, somebody's doing concrete importing for the first time. Somebody's launching Russian satellites for the first time. Somebody's building an oil pipeline for the first time. You're dealing with discrete and separate control groups in Russia, and they tell you, don't worry about what the other guy does, just listen to what we're going to do, and we're going to work together. That's what I think, that's what I see happening. I see companies going in and doing something for the first time in different areas and ending up getting burned.
Yeah,
So-
I'm really talking about the issue of trust, because it seemed like they breached the contract. How is that really going to, in your opinion, is it going to really affect their ability to get further contracts in the future, or has it already affected things to your knowledge?
Well, I think that again, my knowledge of what other people are doing is somewhat limited, but anyone who is going to put a lot of money into a joint Russian space effort has got to look at the RIMSAT experience with great concern. And that's all I can say. I mean, whether Hughes is holding back or some other major American company is holding back, who knows? I don't know. What has happened here is that you have probably $1 million a month in leasing revenues going into a bank account in Budapest. And who knows where the money is going, and it's suspicious enough that it was sent to an offshore account. So my view of dealing with the Russian and Russian-related agencies in the space industry is that they're functionally unreliable. They don't have the money to support themselves, and the contract value that you enter into agreements with, you learn sooner or later, won't support their effort, or the money is used for collateral purposes like salaries or medical benefits or something, and the satellites don't get built. No one knows where the money that we paid the Russians for satellites went. And there was $8 million deposited on the third satellite, Express. It just disappeared into thin air. Now, did it go to pay for building a hospital in Krasnoyarsk? I hope so. It went anyway. I hope it didn't go into somebody's Swiss bank account, but I don't know. It's totally unaccounted. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks very much.